it's the platinum source for whole beat. It's black on white, the description on whole beat. 8th note 72 or 8th note 88 represent the 16th notes in the composition. So whenever someone speaks about the 8th symphony as being the Metronome Symphony, it's quite obvious that the second movement, the Allegretto scherzando, is actually what people are pointing to. There is no debate that I know about that actually doubts the question or doubts the fact that Beethoven made a kind of joke or a kind of imitation, if you want, with the second movement of this symphony, an imitation of the metronome ticks.
When we get to the second movement, he is really enjoying himself. He's having fun because he's taking the new invention by Menzel of the metronome and saying, yes, Mr. Menzel, I can deal with this. And so yep, a completely mechanical articulation in the woodwind instruments.
If you don't know that movement or the symphony, and if you have missed for some reason the recent release of the 8th Symphony and the fabulous four-hand transcription by Karl Czerny here on this channel, I just give you a short excerpt of that recording. Here it is. So these ta, 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 or if you play it in single beat, ta, 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 those 16th notes go, they continue in the entire movement. They have something very mechanical, and it shouldn't surprise us that people back then, as we today still, are fascinated by mechanical machines. I just give you a few short excerpts of that show what people were capable in making, and you quickly understand that in those days, still today, but certainly in those days, those machines must have been like the top of the top segment of engineering.
One of the H tunes, which we can hear on the organ when it plays, is actually composed by Haydn, and it's known as the Call of the Quail.
And so whenever you play that movement in an orchestra, but in our case here on the piano, I remember when we were rehearsing that, Alberto and I, you cannot escape the feeling of being one of those puppets, you know. And in fact, to enhance this effect of this machine-like composition, you would say, a composition that is made with a machine in mind, with an automatic player in mind, what we did on the piano was actually make the releases of the notes pretty hard. So no soft releases here. When you release a note very quickly, then even on a piano, on a clavichord, this would have a gigantic effect. But even on a forte piano, certainly. But I can imagine still on a Steinway today, though that effect would maybe a little bit less. But on this piano, it was wonderful to see for both Alberto and I how suddenly this sound became also a little bit more mechanic. So the soft releases are when you release the key very softly, very gently, when the tone gets this like nice decrescendo. When we release hard, so you have to kind of firm wrist going out of the key, and that of course with every note in the entire movement, which is not easy, you get this kind of imitation of, again, this kind of metronome ticking machine imitation. Another short excerpt, now that you know this hard release thing, maybe you will hear it and you will maybe, perceive this music in a different way. Here it is. There is another source, however, 19th century source that points very strongly, or that actually built this connection pretty strongly. And that source is to be found in the third edition of the Schindler biography, so the Schindler-Beethoven biography. You all know that Anton Schindler was kind of secretary to Beethoven. They had a troubled relationship by times, but he was the first Beethoven biographer in 1840. And in the third edition, he brings a story that Beethoven actually composed a farewell canon to Melzel, exactly with this theme. Beethoven, in his words, would have improvised this during a dinner that he and Melzel and some other friends had just the evening before Melzel left Vienna. Now, recent scholars have doubted that story because the dates that Schindler gives in his biography seem not to match really the times where Melzel actually was in Vienna. So Schindler has messed up a little bit there. And they go even as far as to say that Beethoven never composed this canon, so that this theme or the Eighth Symphony did not come forth from this improvisation of this so-called Melzel canon. So it might very well be that Beethoven composed it, or it might very well be that Beethoven didn't compose it. But for this metronome story, connecting the metronome to that movement and learning what it can mean for us, it's not important whether Schindler composed that and it was a forgery or was a fraud, or Beethoven composed that. But there is another aspect in this Melzel canon story, regardless as whether Schindler made this all up, this story, whether he composed this canon or not, he explains the relationship between the metronome mark and that canon. In other words, between the metronome mark and the 16th notes. And what he says is the following, that the ta-ta-ta-tas represent the ticks of the metronome. Now, before we dive into this a little bit more, I'd give you again a short fragment of Alberto and my recording of this movement and compare that to Gardner's recording of this movement. Gardner's here is spot on single beat. So when he talks about this metronome mark 8th note 72 in case of the canon, or 8th note 88 in case of the movement of the symphony, he connects that note value, 8th note, to the 16th notes of the composition. In other words, he connects the ticks of the metronome to the 16th notes and not to the 8th note, as the metronome mark suggests in single beat reading. Now that you know this, listen again to both fragments. And so this becomes pretty clear. This movement represents the mechanical attitude of a metronome. And doesn't it make sense that from that perspective, that Schindler actually says the most obvious thing that, by the way, was never discussed in the entire 19th century. You don't find anything that anybody saying there's an 8th note in the metronome mark and he connects it to the 16th notes. I mean, what an obvious mistake. Nobody says that. It's only recently that scholars started to just disconnect that. And they don't say why they disconnect that. And we all know that the musical system, they want to protect this kind of single beat fantasy because it is. I mean,
and then the last movement is just preposterous, especially if you get anywhere near the tempo indication that he indicates, which is semi-breve equals 84, which is you just can't get close to it.
It's pretty obvious that in our version, the ta-ta-ta, we start with the ticks of the metronome. And in Gardner's version, he goes twice as fast as the ticks of the metronome. So, yeah, what else do you want to have? Imagine just for a moment that we would have a handwritten version of this canon in Beethoven's handwriting, that we would have the autograph, the manuscript, so to say. And imagine, it's just an imagination, but imagine that instead of Schindler writing this, it was Beethoven writing this in a letter. Discussion over, right? You can accuse Schindler from being a forger and have done everything wrong that you can come up with, but he didn't had the intention of inventing a metronome practice, right? And yet 8th note 72, the 8th note represents the 16 notes. That's the whole beat theory. And so what's in for you in this story? I hope it's clear by now that this medium that we have here, out of this video medium, I'm talking to a camera, but I'm actually talking to you. It's of course not a book. The tempo book that we are writing and it's about to be finished, that will be a pretty complete story where you can page through and you say, I want to know a little bit more about this, a little bit more about that. But a video, of course, doesn't work like that. What I give you here are hints, and more than hints, pieces, historical pieces, facts, historical sources that I connect to each other. And you should actually see all the videos, but that's basically impossible. I get that. But those little hints can, confirm your idea. Or in other words, if you are in this gray zone, saying like, oh, this sounds logic, but was it really true? Then this source is for you a platinum source as well, because it should be able to convince you that it was. And so when you wake up in the morning, after accepting the WBMP to be an historical fact, when you wake up in the morning, you will realize the difference pretty soon, because you will realize that Mozart sonata or that Beethoven sonata, I know I've said it a lot of times, but I'm going to repeat it anyways, that those works were written for you, and that Beethoven or Chopin didn't write music for the 0.1% of the pianists who even then struggle, playing their music in the right way. No, they wrote music for you. And so it's all up to you and to us what we do with this information. We can, on this channel, we have, I think, brought so many sources now that you cannot explain differently than from then from the perspective where we take the WBMP as the foundation. So if we don't do that, if we don't take the WBMP as a foundation, then everything that I bring on the channel becomes like a printing mistake, or people in the 19th century not wearing, didn't know what they, broken metronomes, even broken pendulums, as we saw recently. So it doesn't make sense that way. And that's the thing that I'm just trying to convince you of. There is only one historical foundation. If you accept the WBMP for just one day, you will see there is a chain of reactions like, oh yes, everything falls together, comes together. And this Schindler code, again, is this Metronome Symphony. This movement is one of the most and the strongest cases. If you want to know more about the details and the context of this Schindler source, just click on this video over here. That walks you through more details than I did in this video. So see you on the other side, and thank you for watching. Bye.